Figure it out right now. Okay, who has it figured out? Please raise your hand. You know who you're going to talk to. I'm sorry, did it? Are we getting closer? Is this not a good idea to raise? Is this a bad thing to do in the culture? I don't want to. Am I missing something? It's okay? All right. All right, so we want to present to you 4 situations, and then we would like you to tell us, well, to talk about with your partner what things are similar in these 4 different situations and what things are different about these 4 situations. You'll likely find some similarities, and you will likely find some differences, and we would like you to think about those. We're going to give you about 5 minutes to talk about these, and as soon as that's over, Dr. Baumgardner is going to start. And when he starts, I suspect for most of you, it will give you a new way of seeing these 4 challenges. It's brilliant. I love this, and so that's why we just give you a little snapshot. Okay, here are the 4 situations. Number 1, reimbursement of expenses. When you go home, what's the first thing on someone's list? Anyone have this the first thing on their list? Or maybe it's before you even get home, right? Get this thing done. Okay, that's just a leadership situation that happens. Here's another leadership situation that can happen. Inside of your facility, there can be a major disruption in a service or a system that you didn't plan on having it go down. There's a real problem, and it needs to be fixed. And you have the power to fix it, but there's some sort of facility system failure, okay? That's a situation. You could probably think inside of your conference office or your unit, something happens and you can't do your work. The internet shuts down, you have some technical issue inside, and you have to deal with it. Okay, that's another situation. Let me give you a third one. There are ways in which you know that your organization is on the right track. And one of these indicators is not going the right direction. And that's a situation. Okay? I know we're going a lot of different situations. Okay, now for something a little more concrete, and that is leading an organization during the first months of COVID-19. Do you remember what that was like? All right. So just with your neighbor, with your partner, with in a quick 5-minute discussion, how are these similar and how are they different? This discussion that you have right now, how you use this next 5 minutes, will help you when Dr. Baumgardner gives his presentation. If you don't do this, if you don't spend time on this, you won't get as much out of it, okay? So please do that. Okay, 5 minutes, go.
Just keep it on there so that they can look at it. They wanted to have a file and run the video from below.
Okay, you have just about 1 more minute to finish up the discussion. 1 more minute.
All right. I can see that you are really thinking about these 4 types of problems or situations. When you ask for a reimbursement of an expense, what happens when you forget to also attach the receipts? Will you get a reimbursement without? No. So there are policies or there are processes that make this a very simple problem, right? But it gets a little bit more complicated when there is a problem with the building. The septic system, the toilet does not work and is overflowing. What do you need to do? You need to call somebody, right? The repairman. Somebody who knows how to fix it. Right? What about this problem? Falling indicator of organizational growth. I don't know what you use as your indicator, as an example. Now, if you're in the hospital, it may be the rate of occupancy of the hospital beds. If it's below a certain percentage, what happens? You're not making enough money in order to keep the hospital in operation, right? Or let's go to the church organization. What would be an indicator of organizational growth that we use every quarter? I can hear it. The baptismal numbers that come in. Now you notice, for instance, that in one of your districts, the numbers consistently are low and low and low. And you know there's a problem, but how do you fix it? It's not just a simple thing, a phone call. Hey, these indicators, they need to go up again. It's not so easy, you know? I remember in one country where the average pastor had 100 baptisms per year. And then I visited in that country a city. And I asked the pastor, he says, how many baptisms did you have last year? And it was only a third of the average in that country. I said, is that a problem? He says, we have had this problem for a long time. This city is really difficult. So how do you fix that? When in the context, it's not that easy to get those baptismal numbers. And when your reputation as a leader is at stake, how do you go about this type of problem, which is a very real problem in many areas of the world that we call Western countries, secularized countries, and so on. And you may have a place in your field that is not as growing as the other one. How do you address these kinds of situations? Oh, and then the fourth one, we all remember. COVID-19. Government said, churches, no church services. We had never faced that before. So what do? We would like to give you now a framework that talks about these kinds of different kinds of problems. And we have a little video that will introduce the framework, okay?
So over time, leaders develop patterns and habits in the way we approach things. And often those patterns and habits have worked really well for us in the past. And the problem with them is that we get so used to them that we can forget what the situation calls for and just rely on our own habits. And that's why Dave Snowden's Cynefin framework is really helpful, both for us to use to think about ourselves and to use to think about how do we address things with teams. Snowden's framework makes the big distinction between those things which are predictable and those things which are unpredictable. In the predictable world, you can expect things to repeat time after time. They just cycle around. In the unpredictable world, though, things are really different. They don't necessarily happen again in the way they've happened before. He further then separates the predictable world into two different categories. The things that are obvious are those things that everybody agrees. The connection between cause and effect is so tight, it's so apparent, it's so clear, that there's best practice around that stuff. It's well researched. So those are the things like, say, there's a recipe for it almost. Like you bake a cake one time, you know how it's going to come out. You bake it again, it's going to come out the same way if you use the same ingredients and the same recipe. And in the obvious space, you should be able to get things that repeat predictably time after time using best practices and recipes, checklists, things like that. In the complicated space, which is the other domain Snowden talks about in the predictable world, in the complicated space, it's different. There is a connection between cause and effect, but it's kind of fuzzy, and you need experts to figure it out. So things repeat over time, but you need a lot of experience or domain expertise to know which approach to take. This isn't the place where we'd have best practice, because experts might disagree about these things. This is the place we'd have good practice, where solid experts with really good research or experience would say, I think you should go this way. Another expert might say, I think you should go this other way. But in general, they're going in the same direction. Things like really hard things that have lots of moving parts can be in this category. Things like bringing a person to the moon, making a rocket ship go to the moon. That lives in this domain, in fact. So you get engineers and scientists and people in charge of rockets and fuel, and all those folks each work together on their own piece. You put it together, and you have a machine that will take you someplace wonderful. When you cross over into the unpredictable domain, actually the rules all change. And how we act as leaders also needs to change. Over here, you can't tell what's going to happen next simply because it's happened before. You need to come up with new approaches, novel approaches, safe-to-fail experiments to figure out how to nudge the system in a new direction. People say parenting isn't rocket science, but actually rocket science is in the complicated domain. Parenting is in the complex domain. Leading people is in the complex domain. Culture change is in the complex domain. These are things that just because they happened one way once, you can't count on them happening that way again. Then Snowden offers us the chaotic domain. And in chaos, there's no connection between cause and effect. We just can't make out the patterns. There, a leader's job is to stabilize the system and see if over time patterns can emerge. We experiment our way, safe-to-fail experiments in the complex space, and then eventually some things will become predictable and repeatable over time. You can move them across the Cynefin map into the complicated space, and then maybe even some of those things become obvious over time. And in that way, as leaders use the whole of the Cynefin map, they can fit their style and their problem-solving approach to the actual conditions at hand instead of relying on our habits, which might take us really well in one area and not so well in another area.
All right, thank you very much. So, there you have it. 4 different kinds of problems. What were the first kind of problems? They called it obvious. We will call it maybe more simple. We will call it simple problems. So let me just go there. All right. So we have the predictable world, and the first type of problem is a simple problem. Why is it simple? Because we can see cause and effect. So you turn in a reimbursement, an expense report, but you don't have your receipts. So you don't get the reimbursement. Instead, you get a little email. Could you please send me the receipts? And it just takes an administrative assistant to make that decision. There's a policy. You don't have to go to the boss to ask, what do I do? He did not send in the receipts. You know how to fix the problem. Everybody knows what should have been done. It's obvious. It's simple. But then we have, still in the predictable world, complicated problems. Now there you still have cause and effect, but it's a little bit more complicated because there are more than one or two or even three things that work together. And you need people who have been trained, who know how to fix these kinds of problems. So that's the complicated. Then we have the complex area and the chaotic area in the unpredictable side of things. And as leaders of churches and church organizations and the different organizations that we have in order to reach the communities and serve our communities, these are things that you very often have to deal with. So, while it is easy in the predictable world to just apply a solution that we already know exists, it is not so simple in the complicated realm, because first of all we need to find out what is exactly the problem and whom can we call upon that has the expertise. But very often you have a building manager who knows who the people are that we can call on, and depending on the urgency, we may even be willing to call a service that is available to us when the person that we usually have in the building that fixes those problems is, for instance, on vacation. What do? You have to find another solution. But complicated problems, building projects, for instance. How easy is it to start a building project? Well, first of all, you have to decide, do we really need that building? Who will work in the committee that will set it all up? Can you see there's all kinds of steps that need to be taken? That makes that process quite complicated. And in this particular model, notice that we use the words complicated and complex in different ways. We use the word complicated when it is predictable. Every one of you probably has been responsible in some way for a building project. And when you do one building successfully, you gain a lot of experience so that the next time you build, you will probably be more successful because you make mistakes in the first project, but you learn from it and you will get better and better. But now let's move to the complex area. You are all parents. So you raised your first child successfully. We heard Elder Biagi talking about the need to keep our children in the church, faithful to Jesus Christ. How easy is that? I was talking yesterday to our dear sister who has come from the General Conference for children's ministry. Why do we have children's ministry as a department in the church? Isn't it easy to raise our children and they automatically follow our ways? Or let me ask you this question. If you raise one child successfully, what's the guarantee that the second child will turn out successful also? We all know there is no guarantee. There are principles that we can follow. How successful was Jesus to bring all his disciples into his kingdom? Not even Jesus succeeded with all 12 of them. We know it because one of them betrayed him and took his own life. Now, why do we call this the complex problem or a complex situation? What makes it so complex? What makes it so unpredictable? We're not saying that there is not aspects of the problem that can be predicted. We can make it more likely to find a good solution. But let's go back to our children. What's the problem that you face when you raise your child? Why is it not totally predictable? Our children, they have their own mind, right? They have their own will. And whether you like it or not, and in some societies it's easier to put pressure on them from the family or from the group, from the church and so on. But you also notice something. The more pressure you put on, the more likely it is that when that child is out of your control, what will he do or she? It's out of the church. Why? Because people have their own mind, they have their own heart, and you will not be able to force them. Not even God can force them. And God respects their will. And that's what makes these kinds of problems so difficult. And very often what we have to do is, we don't necessarily know the solutions to the problem, but we have to experiment. Which means that we are not sure if it will succeed. But if we experiment enough, then we realize, hey, some things work better than other things. And we can actually eventually find solutions that work. That's why it is called here, while we have good practice with complicated problems, we have kind of emergent practice, meaning we, as parents, sometimes we have to find our way with the type of children that we have. I remember my oldest was a child that was very curious, and he would, when I would read him a story, he would be able to tell me the story almost word for word. He just absorbed everything. My second child was very different. He would sit on the floor and he would start concentrating on understanding what he had, and he would play with it, he would take it apart, putting it better and back together. And when you interrupted him, he would throw a temper tantrum as if you had just violated him. And it was very difficult when we wanted to go to church in the morning. I knew I would need an extra 15 minutes with him to warn him, to interrupt what he was doing, to help him with the next step, and so on. I couldn't just go and interrupt him and pick him up and say, we need to go now, because it would be misery. So he was the child that would sometimes come to the car with only one sock on and so on. So you can imagine the embarrassment as pastor with a child like that. But I had to learn to work with him according to his personality. And later out, we found out that he was a very brilliant child, But psychologists have all kinds of labels for these kinds of children that have a special brain that is able to concentrate energy on one thing, but they lose track of the world around them. Very different and very difficult. The solutions that worked with my oldest did not work with my middle son. And then finally, we have the chaotic realm. You have a crisis. There was an accident. Have you ever been on the road and you come to a place and suddenly you realize there has been an accident? So you get out of the car and you see somebody bleeding on the ground. What do? Now this morning I had the privilege to eat with one of your physicians here. So if you're a physician, you probably would know what to do. You would jump into action and literally stop the bleeding. You know, that's the most important thing. You don't ask for permission. You see the problem, you move in. In crisis mode, what is needed is a leader stepping in and doing what is necessary. You don't ask permission necessarily, you just stop in. Now, how do we apply that to our leadership practices? And what does this model tell us about our own leadership? Can you see that in each of these domains, our approach to leadership is different? Can you see that? There's a difference. How do you address a simple problem from a complicated problem? And then what is the most difficult for many leaders is they know solutions that worked in one situation, and we are tempted to automatically assume it will work in another situation. But the truth is, very often, especially when you have different people and different regions and different customs and so on, what worked in one region doesn't work in another. I remember in Brazil, I was giving a seminar in the northeast of Brazil, a wonderful place to be. The workers were so energetic, and we were eating, and suddenly somebody walks out to me and says, "You saved my ministry." And I said, "What? How did I do that? I don't know you, my brother. Who are you?" And he explained to me that he had been working in one place in Brazil and was very successful, and then he had been transferred into a different region. And he said, from there on, everything went downhill. I did the same thing. I was as vigilant, I worked as hard, I had the same evangelistic campaigns, and nothing worked. And it got so bad because I became irritant with my wife, so my marriage started to fail. And then I came across a little book that was translated into Portuguese, and it was called Passport to Mission. It's a simple book that we created for our missionaries. I used to work with the Mission Institute, and that's where we created that book. And he said, when I got that book, I realized that maybe it's culture. Maybe the context is different, and my methods need to be adjusted. That was exactly what was needed. So this was the complex problem for him, and as he started to experiment with new ways, it saved his ministry and it saved his marriage. Why do I bring that example? What do we need to learn as leaders about these types of problems? What happens when we use methods that work for simple problems and we apply them to complex problems? You know what happens? first of all, probably your solutions will not be effective. Number two, you will get really tense over it because it doesn't seem to work. That reflects back on you as a leader, and you get sometimes really, it's more difficult when you realize that what the good solution that is tried and true from your past doesn't work right now. And this is one of the issues that we are trying to address. See, let's take, for instance, these 4 different types of problems and ask ourselves, what category do these 4 fall into? Reimbursement of expenses, what kind of a problem is that? It's a simple problem. The system failure in a building, it's a complicated problem. You're good. What about addressing the problem of a falling indicator of growth in your organization? That is a complex problem. How do we address a complex problem? We need to make room for innovation. You need to give permission for people to actually experiment. However, you may want to stay in conversation with people and say, report back to me what you have tried and let's see if we can find a solution together. Also, in this area, you want to bring people around the table to talk to each other, what has been tried in different situations, and so on. It's a different leadership style. And what about the 4th one? You have gone through COVID-19. How was that experience, by the way, when all the churches were shut down? How did that feel in your field? I only remember it felt very strange when the pastor announced to the church, we won't have a church service today. We won't have a church service? It was almost as if the church no longer existed. And then quickly we had to find out, what do we do? Well, there was the pastor preaching on the pulpit, and it was transmitted through Zoom or through YouTube and so on. And we got used to that. And many churches just had one goal, to make sure that the sermon was transmitted by video in some ways. But then there were all other churches that started to treat this problem as for instance, a complex problem. And they said, what can we do to take advantage of the situation, to do something that we would have never thought doing in the past, but that might be possible right now? Because some churches found out that they can actually create a new method to reach people because people were lost and they wanted to connect with communities that were willing to bring them in. You know, I remember the first time I saw one of those videos where people were singing together. There was one person, and then suddenly the picture of another person came in and they were singing together, and then another one joined and so on. There were all kinds of very interesting combinations of how musicians started to bring together their music while they were often in different spaces. Now they had to use new software and so on. It was a complex problem, but it was born out of chaos, because chaos, what you do is, first of all, if there's an emergency, step number 1, you make sure that if somebody is being hurt, that stops. But then number 2, you ask yourself, okay, now what do we do now? And so very often what you do is you move the problem up to the complex level or to the complicated. If it's a technical thing, you know, there's wonderful videos. I remember out of the General Conference, there was a video that was created that was such a blessing to the World Church when it came out. Was very well done, a choir, different pieces, and an excellent video in the process. Many churches, after COVID-19, just went back to the same routine that they had before. And I fear what happened is that the church overlooked one little fact, that the world has changed and the expectations of people have changed. And if we don't calculate that in, we miss an opportunity to actually become more effective how we reach. But we will talk about that more as we go into our Leadership Growth series. So, what we are trying to communicate to you right now is that sometimes having a framework that helps us conceptually deal with the day-to-day problems can be a real help to us. It's not that the experts, you know, Dr. Siebold and Dr. Baumgartner, want to flood you with theory. That's not what the Lead Lab is all about. But we are using concepts here and there that help us in our practical problems that we face every day. And sometimes we use tables like this. Sometimes we start talking about it, and I won't take the time to do that right now. But I just want to highlight one sentence here, and it's this one. What we have learned this morning is that when we apply simple or complicated problem solutions to complex problem, often what we create is more chaos, more problems than we solve. And so what we have to learn is how to actually use the right kind of approach to leadership for the situations that we find ourselves in. So, what we have been doing is we have been talking about the module number 3, you know, that third circle that Dr. Siebold started us out in how to lead within organizations. And so here are some of the subjects that we have dealt with in other fields. That's not necessarily the same subjects that we will do here in the SSD, because we have not yet had the strategic conversations with Elder Cadero and his team, so that might be a little bit different. So building thriving organizations, what does that look like? Understanding and leading change. Of course, we need to focus on our mission and the vision that derives out of it, and what are the values that we represent as a community, and what are the strategies that are appropriate to reach the goals for our mission. And then innovation. Now you understand why innovation needs to be part of our vocabulary and part of our set of skills that we need to hone, because complex problems demand innovation. What worked in the past does not always work right now and might not work in the future. We also need to learn how to evaluate what we are doing. And different approaches, especially those approaches that work with innovation, may need new ways of evaluating, because when somebody tries something new and fails, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, it can be both. Bad thing because we wish we had found the solution, but we are not there yet. But now we know what doesn't work, so let's try something else. And so how we apply program evaluation is an issue that we have to wrestle with and be able, or simple execution of strategies. We use an approach called 4DX, the 4 disciplines of execution, and it has been helpful in some places to just think about it and how we implement that. All right, so we have a few seconds more, and here's what I would like you to think about. What did you learn today in this past hour? And that was useful to you. And might there be something that you have, just an idea that you got, that you can actually use? Could you turn to your neighbor right now and share one thing that was interesting or that you learned today? All right. I hope that what we did this morning was helpful to some of you. We realize what we're doing here is very fast, just giving you highlights what we might do in the different modules of the growth series. And this afternoon, Dr. Siebelt will be giving you some reasons about how we do things. We will talk about our learning engine that we have found very effective in our doctoral programs, in our master's programs that we have had, where people have said to us, wow, this is different. Why do you do it that way? And we will actually give you a little bit of a hint. We let you into behind the curtain, a look at our learning engine. So that will be in the afternoon. We hope you can be here after lunch, even though the food here is so good. And then a nap would be appropriate. Set your timer to be back at 1:30, okay? Why don't we have prayer? Could I invite you to stand, please, for our prayer? Dear Father in heaven, we thank you that you are a God who looked down on this earth in all its beauty, but also in its lostness. And you were willing to come down through Jesus Christ to this earth to do the unthinkable. You found a solution for the sin problem that will eternally cure this planet from the sin problem. We thank you, Lord, that you were willing to give everything to show us that you really mean to love us. And we thank you for those little glimpses that we have had this morning, also what that means for us as leaders in terms of our leadership. We pray that as we continue thinking together how to become growing leaders and how to be growing leaders in your kingdom, that you may continue to bless us. Thank you for everyone in this room I pray for a blessing on each of the families represented here. We love you, Lord, and we thank you for your faithfulness to us. Keep us faithful to you. In Jesus' name, amen.
We certainly appreciate the presentation of Dr. Baumgartner and Dr. Schibold, providing us a very important framework on how we are going to deal on complicated issues in our leadership. Before we go out, I would like to share two announcements here. The first one is for the NPUC delegation. Kindly stay by for your picture taking. This is coming from your administration. Okay, thank you. Another one is this afternoon, the program will start at 1:30 and ends at 3:30. So I would like to encourage everyone to please come after the dinner, the lunch. You please come immediately so that we can maximize our time. And here is an additional announcement. The tri-union officers will be having their meeting at 3:30, just right after the meeting. The Philippine tri-union, because we have so many unions here. But this is specifically...
Okay, so that's a wrap. And the morning session of day 3 of SSD Leadership Summit is finally done. But of course, we would like to thank you for all your comments and of course your wonderful insights that you have shared with us during the live session. So please keep it coming as we resume our session at 1:30 p.m. this afternoon. Also, we would like to invite everyone that we're going to have a very special Vesper service this evening at 7 o'clock p.m. So please don't miss out and share this information to your family and friends. So again, this is Jessica Vicente, and we'll see you at 1:30 p.m.